All right.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, everybody. So this is a conference on science fiction, games, and technology. You've got all three of those things here. You've got science, fiction, games, and technology, both of us, and they kind of interweave in a very interesting way with us, with the two of us particularly. So we're going to start by introducing ourselves briefly, and then we'll talk about that intersection. So I am a longtime tech entrepreneur. Years ago, I started a company called Listen.com, which created the Rhapsody music service, for those of you with very long memories. And after I sold that company, I became an angel investor. But I also started writing long, sprawling science fiction novels for Random House. Novels like this one. Did I get that right side up? After On. This comes out in August, so this is not actually a book. It's just, I guess it's tonight's demo. And I'm glad it has not crashed on me. So I've made that transition, and I try in my work to tighten the loop between science fiction and science. I set my stories in present-day America. This book is set in present-day science, San Francisco, and I try to ground things in present-day realities and talk about developments that, if not exactly likely, are entirely plausible with the technologies that we have today. And so I do a great deal of research in those technologies and those sciences. And I experimented extensively with that in this new book. And Adam was a priceless resource to me in that. And Adam, your background.
Sure. So I have an unusual background considering the work that we do now. I'm trained both as a medical doctor, a neurologist, and a neuroscientist. I'm a professor at UCSF, and I direct a center called Neuroscape. And although I'm not going to give you my whole pathway, but what happened around 8 years ago is I became interested in how technology, especially consumer-facing, non-invasive technology, might be used to help improve brain function. And so what our center really focuses on now is how to integrate tech and neuroscience to produce new tools to assess the brain in a real-world way and to help improve brain function. And one of the main things we do to accomplish that is to build video games and then validate them.
So now we have, as you've seen with these fireside talks, we are now going to interview one another to give you a little bit more context about this. And I'm going to start by interviewing Adam. So Adam, let's talk a little bit more about what you've done and are doing, because obviously video games is a topic of great interest to those attending this conference. What's some of the stuff that you're doing currently with video games that's been most exciting?
Yeah, just to give two sentences of context, or else it's like video games and neuroscience. How does that happen? As a neurologist, I've been very frustrated with the tools that we have to treat cognition deficits, and I use that term broadly, including emotional regulation, depression, anxiety, attention deficits across the entire lifespan, early dementia. We just don't have drugs that work very well. They have side effects, they're not personalized. And so the idea of creating a video game as an experiential treatment, and really harnessing what our brain does, which is it modifies itself based on experience. That's the entire basis of neuroplasticity. And you could do that in a lot of boring ways, or what I felt is that you could do it in an engaging, immersive way, and that would be through video games. And so we custom build video games from scratch, targeting different neural systems that we want to enhance by using game mechanics, and then using algorithms that are adaptive. We feed a player's performance metrics into the game engine. The game updates the environment, the challenge, the reward cycles in real time, and creates this closed loop system between a player's brain, and a game. And so we build our games from scratch, as I said, working with lots of professionals in the video game industry. And then we go through studies to validate if they actually work and do what we intend them to do.
And some fairly august journals have had an interest in this. One, a particularly well-known one, it's got a single digit. Is it Nature or is it Science? Nature, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So
let's talk about the Nature paper, because that was a really big deal. It was on the cover.
Yeah, it was the cover of Nature in the end of 2013. We built a game called NeuroRacer with friends of mine that worked at LucasArts, and it's this adaptive multitasking game. And we had a hypothesis that if older adults played this game, they'd improve their ability to multitask on the game, but other cognitive abilities that are mechanistically related to multitasking, like attention and short-term memory, would also improve. And that's what we showed. And we also recorded brain activity during gameplay to show what was actually changing in the brain to lead to those effects.
Now, because you cannot say VentureBeat without saying venture, I thought it might be interesting to talk about the company that's productizing this stuff right now, this venture-backed startup in Boston.
Yeah, so one of the goals that I always had was not just to have the science end with a peer-reviewed publication, even one in Nature. And so I helped co-found a company called Akili, which is based in Boston and San Francisco. We recently just had a very nice Series B round, and we're all set to go to our first product. But what makes Achille really unique is that we don't have any revenue now. We don't have a consumer product. We've made this decision to not have something until we reach the highest level of regulatory approval. So we have multiple trials now in conditions like autism and depression and post-traumatic stress disorder and early Alzheimer's disease and multiple sclerosis, on, to show that we can use game technology as high-level diagnostic tools and treatment tools. And the study that's furthest along that gets most attention is we have a phase 3 trial to get our game approved as a prescribable, FDA-approved treatment for children with ADHD.
And are you public about the amounts that you've raised and the sources of those funds?
Yeah, it's public. Our last round was a $42 million round and was really led largely by pharmaceutical companies, Merck, Amgen, others, as well as biotech investment companies in Europe and in the States like PureTech Ventures, Jazz Ventures, a venture fund that I'm involved with. It was an unusual path for us not to see the support or the positioning coming from the tech community, although at our core we're a video game company. I mean, we're a medical video game company, but most of the support did come through the biotech world, and I think that's largely because the timeline of what we're building is very long compared to a lot of consumer technology.
And what science fiction influenced you, either as a kid and or in your career choices?
I have always been influenced by science fiction. Since I was 7 years old, reading it, it was one of the strongest motivators to become a scientist in the first place. Isaac Asimov was my hero in reading, starting with the Foundation series and on. And still to this day, every single day, I read a little science fiction. I read more science fiction than the news, especially lately, because it's terrifying. But I really find that it just sparks my creativity and takes me out of what we're doing today to what we can do tomorrow. Which is a perfect segue.
It is a segue.
So,
not that we planned it this way.
Yeah, so that worked out quite well. Okay, Rob, so why don't we start digging a little deeper into what might be interesting to people, and how did you move from entrepreneurship into becoming a science fiction writer?
Yeah, so I always loved to write, and going as far back really as high school, I'd write for the papers and do this kind of thing. And when I became an adult, I was kind of torn between whether I wanted to be involved in high tech as an entrepreneur or to write about technology, which is something that I really got a big kick out of. So really through the first 10, 12 years of my career, when I was a VC briefly and then starting companies, I took every opportunity I could to write. I wrote 2 business books, wrote a cover story for Wired, and I had a pretty good platform as a technology entrepreneur and quote unquote innovator and so forth to write things for publications of large stature. So that's kind of how I honed it, but I always really wanted to write fiction. And so after I sold the company that started the Rhapsody Music Service to Real Networks, I stayed there for a period of time and then started my angel investing, and that was really fun and exciting. And at some point, my wife just sat me down and was like, look, you've always wanted to write fiction. Why don't you do it? So I wrote the strangest novel I could think of with the full intention of self-publishing it because I really figured nobody other than Larry Lessig and myself, and maybe my parents, would want to read it. And that's how I broke into science fiction.
And this is closely related to your startup.
Yeah, it was kind of like a primal scream therapy for me. So with Rhapsody, we were the first company to get full catalog licenses from all the major music labels. And we created basically, we are to Spotify what VisiCalc is to Excel. So we were the first people to put together that unlimited on-demand streaming model. And as a result of that, I learned way more than I'd ever wanted to know about the insanity of copyright laws and also intellectual property laws in this country. And I think that there's some things that are very sensical, but there's some things that are very nonsensical. So I wrote the tale, the book's called Year Zero, of a vast alien civilization that is so into American pop music that they accidentally commit the biggest copyright infringement since the dawn of time and bankrupt the entire universe. And that was my first novel, and to my astonishment, thank you.
It's great, by the way.
Thank you.
I've read it.
I still had an agent from the business books that I'd written, and I sent it to her almost as a joke, and she got back to me and said, oh yeah, this is publishable. I said, really? And she's like, Rob, was Jurassic Park about genomics or dinosaurs? I'm like, dinosaurs. And this is really a very playful science fiction romp that, yes, is sort of about copyright law. So she got it to Del Rey at Random House, and they published it, and to everybody's absolute astonishment, it actually did, for the shortest possible interval, at almost the lowest possible rank, it did nose in like a prairie dog into the New York Times bestseller list. 1 week, which is the briefest period, and number 22, it's a list of 25. But, skin of the teeth, made it anyway, and that was where my glorious career as a science fiction writer began.
And then this was the birth of not just, a passing hobby and even, a quick success and shine in the limelight, but a career. And now your new book, the big demo sitting there.
It's not crashed yet.
It's more weighty and a more serious book.
Yeah. So I thought this new book would be kind of similarly. So Year Zero is pretty zippy. It's like 300 pages long, and obviously it's very playful. It does have a serious message behind it. And I thought this would be a similar thing. And so the concept I had as I sat down to this was, it's going to be the tale of a diabolical social media company. Kind of embodies everything that's wrong with social media, dialed up by maybe 30%, just to make it fun. And about midway through the book, contrary to the interest of anybody who has anything to do with this company, it will attain consciousness. And rather than going all Terminator and trying to kill us all, it's going to take on its character from that which is a social network. So it basically becomes a hyper-empowered, super-intelligent 14-year-old mean girl. And yes, hilarity does ensue, but as I got into it, and I thought there would be some serious messages about artificial superintelligence risk, but as I started writing it, I actually did start getting a little bit alarmed, and this was right around the time that Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking and Bill Gates and others were starting to raise a little bit of hue and cry about the risks that we faced here. So I actually got very, very deep into that issue and fairly ambitious about telling, really exploring that in addition to telling my tale, in addition to a lot of other scientific topics.
So maybe this is a good point to bring us together a bit. Maybe you could share with why the hell you reached out to me during your research into this book.
Why call Adam Gazzaley at UCSF? So I figured if we're talking about digital consciousness, I could wave my hands for a paragraph and a half, which is how I came up with the notion that humans make the best music in the universe. That was a paragraph of hand waving. But I really wanted to do something that was really, where does consciousness come from, or might it come from? And how might a digital consciousness really arise? And so then we started talking, and I came up with a model of consciousness that I believe, and I believe you believe, is plausible. And the way that I had it happen, so the social network company is called Flutter in my company, P-H-L-U-T-T-R. Yes, I have the URL. And Flutter, when Flutter starts booting up, there's kind of two things that are going on. And there's a theory out there that it's possible that one of the things that generates consciousness in us is the process of discovering the limitations of a physical body and attempting and failing and attempting and failing, all these things that we do as infants. And through that frustrating process of discovering limitations, a very bottom-up process of like colliding and not succeeding, that is potentially something that sits at the root of consciousness. Now, this tied to something that you and I had talked about, which is the notion that goals are really cognitive actors when you think about it. If you acquire a goal and you want to do this thing, and you're a very nascent consciousness or even a pre-consciousness, in that state, every photon, every sound wave, every flick on your skin is coming in with equal intensity. But when you get a goal, start filtering 99% of that out. And so there's this top-down, even if the goal is like, I want some milk, or whatever babies go through, right? Or, I want to knock things over. You start filtering things out, and you're running into these frustrations of a body, and that collision of top up and top down, that could be the magic where consciousness is born. And I got that out of our conversations. How does that map to what you're seeing in the lab and your sort of your conception of where consciousness arises?
Yeah, so this is really fundamental to the work that I've been doing for a long time, over 15 years now, on studying attention. And really, just briefly, there's two ways that we attend to the world around us. One is bottom up. It's how our environment demands our limited resources independent of our goals. And usually it's driven by things that are very salient, has strong evolutionary pressure for survival, something that's very novel, something that has strong sensory stimulation. You pay attention to independent of your goals. And the other, we call that bottom up, and the other's top down. It's what you're doing now. You're choosing to focus your vision, your hearing on this, and therefore it commands a space in your brain. And all of our interactions with the world are essentially this integration of bottom up and top down. I just actually recently had a book myself called The Distracted Mind, where I say that this is the challenge that technology has placed on us, is the strong bottom-up force that we all know about that pulls us away many times from our top-down goals, especially when they need to be sustained for long periods of time on things that are rather boring. But basically, my view is that consciousness lives in this space between bottom up and top down. That if you were a brain that never had sensory stimuli, you would never develop consciousness. And likewise, if you didn't have goals to shape them, then you can't be fully conscious at the highest level. So this was the topic of our dinner conversation. And I have to say, as a scientist, to see it formulated and recreated in fiction, and very funny fiction, was a pretty amazing experience.
You mean funny, ha-ha, not
Yes,
funny,
not
strange.
funny, yeah.
It has playful dimensions. But
Yes.
So the way that I ended up implementing it in Flutter is the company, although it was a social network, it has this big technology incubator. It's buying up all these crazy companies. And there's a robotics incubation thing going on there. And they're trying to get bipedalism to work in a robust way. And it's just not working. Anybody who's worked in robotics can tell you how hard this has been. And so one of the characters in the book is married to a woman who is a neuroscientist at UCSF. And maybe even in your lab, I forget if we put her there, but
I don't think so.
She's discovered these really interesting neural patterns that tie to the fleeting emotions that sometimes we access when we make gut decisions. And her reckless husband implements that in code, and it ends up basically on the Flutter network, and it collides with what's going on in this robot lab where the robots are, the robot pieces are trying to do things and failing and trying and failing and trying and failing. And so that's where the consciousness arises from in the book. And there were a lot of other, so there were three fields that I really dove in deep with scientists. The other two biggies are synthetic biology. There's a great deal about that. I spent a lot of time with a guy named Andy Hessel, who's one of the leading drivers behind the Human Genome 2 project. And then also quantum computing. There's a guy named Hartmut Neven at Google who was very generous with his time. And so my hope, and Random House, at least the first review that we've gotten, seemed to believe we've succeeded at this, is to bring these things out in an accessible way and deeply integrate them into a present-day tale that definitely takes sort of a science fictional turn, and that's been really, really fun. And I want to keep, as a writer who's deeply interested in present-day technology, as an angel investor, and somebody who's of the Valley, this is really what I want to do, at least for the next few years, is really spend time with scientists and bringing in present-day or near-future tech stories from that.
And I know as we were talking on this idea, which is our title of bringing science and science fiction together, you have another project that you're just about to launch related to a podcast on the same idea. Maybe you want to share.
Absolutely. So the book is going to come out on August 1st, and there's a guy named Tom Merritt, who some of you guys may know. He's been bringing technology, culture, and news to the world for about 15 years. He was on Tech TV for a number of years, G4. He was with Leo Laporte. Now he's his own kind of like series of podcasts. And he and I have decided we're going to do an 8-episode podcast that's kind of about the book when the book comes out. And we're going to have, basically we're going to have a guest star each week. Adam kindly agreed in the Uber on the way out here to be one. And what we'll do is we're going to talk about one of the scientific and also geopolitical. There's quite a bit in the book about nihilistic terrorism as well. I spent a lot of time in the Middle East earlier in my life. And we're going to have an expert. We're going to spend 45 minutes really talking about what's going on in that field in a way that's perfectly accessible to non-readers of the book. And then in the last 10 or 15 minutes, we'll say, okay, if you're not a reader of the book, you probably want to check out now because we're about to bore you. But if you're a reader of the book, we're going to talk about the first 75 pages of the book in episode 1, then the next chunk, and the next chunk. There's a lot of podcasts now that take on TV series in this episodic way. So we're going to do that as a way to sort of support the book and hopefully give, the vast majority of Americans are not going to read this book. So hopefully give anybody who's not reading the book really, really good content with great guest stars to talk about synthetic biology and neuroscience and consciousness and artificial superintelligence risk and all these other fascinating things that are afoot.
Cool. So maybe we're out of time now. So
Yep.
why don't we wrap up by, maybe you could let folks know how they could be apprised of all
Yep.
this, and then tell them a little bit about the gift that they can
The giveaway, yes. So the website, if anybody's interested in the book, the podcast is going to be fabulous whether you buy it or not. But the book is, it's after-on.com, and there's a newsletter list there. We don't know the dates of the podcasts. The other thing we're going to do in conjunction with this, and this took a lot of pushing and pulling with Random House, and I know, having dealt with the record companies, how hard it is. We're actually going to give away about the first half of the book. So people who sign up for this program will basically be emailing you each 50, 75-page chunk of the book until we got you really hooked about halfway through, then it stops. But all this is going to be a kind of a fun integrated program. And if you sign up for the newsletter, you'll get a note when it comes out. It's after-on.com. It's a much superior URL when you have the hyphen in there. I had to pay a lot more than just after-on.com, believe me. Then the other thing is, Random House was kind of, the demo, actually on the inside, this is what they send out to reviewers and librarians and booksellers, and they make several hundred of them. I conned Random House into sending 15 of them here. So I am going to be at the DJ booth in the reception that's about to start. And the first 15 people who come up to me, I will be very happy to provision you with the book, because there's a lot more than 15 of you, and maybe at least 16 of you might want to read it at this point. What I'd ask is, come up if either you or a loved one is pretty likely to read this book if it doesn't suck. It is long. It's about 550 pages long, so it's not a light read. But if you or somebody who's close to you in your life, you feel like there's at least a 50% chance that you'll dig into this in the summertime, assuming the book engages you. I'd like to get it to folks who will actually read it, and we're out of time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.